This is the story of the challenge of the philosopher king to all the idealists in the land. A philosopher king put a challenge to the idealists and said, "You will never be able to demonstrate your point and wield the sword." Many tried, many thought that they could, and yet all failed. The philosopher king knew that the idealists would fail, but he hoped that one day they would put aside their childish ideas and learn to use the sword properly. Idealism is not compatible with rationality.
What's up? I am David Long. Maybe you recently saw that I made a video about the Sword in the Stone challenge for idealists, and let's extend it out to the panpsychists as well. Emergentism is a valid scientific theory. These guys don't even have the ability to make a positive rational case for their view. Don't get caught in the false equivalency. Emergentism is a valid theory, and these guys don't have a leg to stand on. What I'm trying to do with this Sword in the Stone challenge is to demonstrate a clear difference between emergentism as a valid scientific theory and idealism as an absolute truth claim that's probably rooted in some superstitious and dogmatic thinking. Because really, at this point in human development, at this point in our development up the spiral, at this point in our ability to have a real community with each other, where we're with people who are actually on our level and able to have adult conversations about what's actually happening in reality, some things need to be established about what kind of a basic worldview we're generally living in. And a lot of people are still bringing a lot of old baggage and wishful thinking along with them. This Sword in the Stone challenge is meant as a clear distinction about where exactly the problem is. If we start with the epistemic primary, the most extreme and humble epistemic primary, and have to build up every aspect of the quadrants to get data from all four quadrants, we can really see what a person's worldview is, what a person's epistemology is, and how they come to their conclusion in the light of their worldview and their methodology. And then we can really point to where the problem is in their logic and why those ideas won't stand.
So we go from only knowing the upper left quadrant to then knowing about the lower left quadrant to then using peer review to understand facts and then theories.
And then hopefully it will become very clear to all of us what's happening. And a lot of the rhetoric and bad ideas that these people have been able to hide behind for a long time will start to become more and more exposed. So some people have insinuated that there's a problem with a materialistic or physicalist or realist cosmology that starts on an epistemic premise of an idealist, Descartes. Well, I understand that everyone has a part of the truth, and when it comes to epistemology, I agree with idealists when they say we only know the world through our senses. Hey, I actually happen to agree with that. So what's good to do if you're having an argument with somebody is start with some shared premises on their side, like, hey, we both agree that you can only know the world through our senses. Now, it seems like you might be starting there and then jumping to conclusions about cosmology without doing any work. Let me show you how I start there, and I go through these different steps to come to my conclusion. Do you have logical steps that lead to your conclusion? Having a ground-up case for your view really shows that you understand your view in a rational context, in a reasonable worldview. And if you go wrong, it'll start to become very clear to everyone else where you went wrong. So what I've done here is I've put my cards on the table. They're out for everyone to see. If I made a mistake at any level, you would be able to point that out to me and call me on it. What you don't hear are people calling me on where my mistake was. You hear other things like David started with an idealistic premise. Okay, how does that negate a case that ends in emergentism? Let's all come to this premise. Let's all end up in this fundamental premise that we know things through our consciousness. And maybe first of all, we have to start there. If we're doing epistemology, you can't assume what consciousness is, or even that other people exist, or even what's happening. It's just like, boom, you woke up in this moment. You can't doubt that you exist. So let's start there. What can we say that we know? How can we figure things out? That's the project. So I'm just taking that project seriously and saying, let's see if we can build a ground up reasonable case for our view. What usually happens when people try to tell you about these different cosmological views, it's like they walk you into a room and there's a buffet table. And on that table are these different ideas. And they're like, emergentism is like this. These are all the different types of materialisms. Then there's idealism, and there's these types of idealism. Then there's panpsychism and these types of, and they're like, which one would you like? Which one seems most appealing to you? This is generally how you're introduced to cosmologies. And what they're not telling you is idealism and panpsychism have no ground. They're not falsifiable. They're empty claims backed up by nothing. There's no good logic or good evidence for those positions. While emergentism is the dominant theory across multiple disciplines. Let me break down a simple principle for you. The valid, cross-disciplinary, accepted scientific theory is better than a hypothesis. And for something to even be considered a hypothesis in the first place, you have to be able to make a logical case for your position. Otherwise, you don't even have a hypothesis. What you have is an empty claim backed up by nothing. And a scientific theory is better than an empty claim backed up by nothing. So if you're the kind of person who doesn't want to accept the scientific data, but would rather believe in an unjustified, empty claim because that's what you like to believe, don't sit there and tell me that you consider yourself to be rational. If we can't even appeal to a well-established scientific theory, and you'd rather go with the unfounded, unfalsified claims of some traditional dogma and a creation myth? Sadly, at the end of the day, what a lot of this comes back to is people who still want to believe in supernatural things. People who still want to believe in things that there's no good evidence for. So with this ground up case, we can start to figure out how you know that information gets put on the table and becomes clear. And how you know is very important. We can also figure out if you have fair overarching standards in your integration or not. So in this Sword in the Stone video, what I'm trying to do is show you how we start with epistemology, and we start with consciousness as the epistemic primary, and we move out through there to get at the exteriors. I'm demonstrating to you my claim about the nested quadratic holon for epistemology, and how applying this epistemology and having this interaction with ontology that we can eventually discover cosmology, and that can also better inform ontology. And then after that, we can figure out morality and what we like. So you have to do these projects in the correct order. Here's the problem with integral. They have the ingredients, but they don't have the recipe. So a lot of times they end up with a bad result, a poor integration. Having all the ingredients isn't enough. You also have to have the recipe. You have to put the ingredients together in the right order. So I make this claim about how we talk about epistemology and ontology and how they relate to each other and how we can develop moving through these different levels of quadrants, developing a good epistemology and coming to good cosmological and ontological conclusions by understanding the right order in which to do these things. This is my claim. I'm backing it up. I'm showing you how it works. The other thing I want to say is this. This video I just made about this Sword in the Stone challenge is to illustrate a particular point. We can know that consciousness is emergent with just deductive reasoning, given what we do know. It's like, I don't need to know how a remote control works to use deductive reasoning to know that it controls my TV. I have one-to-one correlations to pretty well figure out that that's what's going on. I'm saying that figuring out emergentism is something like that. And yes, there's gaps in our knowledge, but in general, I really don't think that there's that much stuff to the point to where we don't know emergentism is true. I think we have a pretty good understanding of how most of the functions of consciousness work and how it evolves at every level, gaining new functions with new equipment, and new social and environmental circumstances that allow for this unfolding to take place and this cumulative effect to come together to culminate in something like the type of subjectivity that you and I are currently experiencing. So I haven't made a super in-depth, super in-detailed case of the different levels and exactly what I think is going on and how I think what arises at what point in depth, and I want to make that video. So I am going to work on doing a more in-depth video about how I think the functions of consciousness emerge. I think that there is a lot to be said about that. There are a bunch of nuanced perspectives. There have been thousands of scientists who have done work on this for hundreds of years. A lot is known about it. I don't pretend like I even began to cover this topic in my last video. I'm just laying out the basic logic for how we can come to a conclusion about emergentism. It's really a bare minimum case to show you that it's a reasonable, logical position and how you can use deductive reasoning to come to this conclusion, even if we don't have all the evidence. Because frankly, what a lot of the idealists and the panpsychists do is they pretend like because you don't have all the evidence, there's still enough of a gap for them to put some doubt on your view. And even if you do have a pretty solid and legit theory, a lot of times they want to act like science is always just changing its mind, and who knows, maybe evolution will be just like totally undone. Gravity, who knows, we don't even really know anything about this stuff, right? They want to make all this mystery and cast all this doubt so that way they can make their unjustified ideas seem legit. It's all based on this false equivalency, which is why I'm asking for a positive ground up case. Because so much of what these idealists and panpsychists do is talk about science. And they do all this work basically to bring down science to this level where it's just a dogma and it doesn't know and all this. And so that way they can pass off their thing as somehow valid instead of making a ground up positive case for their view, because they can't really do it. There's not a good reason to believe in some ultimate mind behind everything, or that everything has a soul, or that things that are non-living have some form of consciousness. They literally do nothing to make us think that's the case. That's why we make a distinction between living things and non-living things. Also, the reason I'm trying to do it in this format is because if we can lay out our case in advance and make it clear, then we can have a debate in a way that's actually objective, where we can come to real conclusions about what's actually going on, and we can really establish things together. In the big picture, this is what I'm hoping that we can really do, is that we can get past these green subjective, leave it to the audience types of things, and we can actually make real distinctions and come to real conclusions about what's actually true at the end of the day, so we can establish something and move on. Because the real interesting, important topics happen on the other side of accepting certain truths about reality. So most of the people in the integral community, of course, are coming from the more Wilbur type perspective. Most of them, when they are coming from this idealistic perspective, they're thinking of it in the Advaita Vedanta, Buddhist, Hindu kind of way of thinking about it. There's also some of these other people like Leo Gura and some of these other people who are doing the spiritual experience, I'm awake on God kind of thing. And of course, we can talk about what the potentially morally problematic aspects of those things are. I talk about that in my What You Talking About, Wilbur Part 2 and some of my other videos where I talk about how there can be a problem with spiritual bypassing or not having a healthy relationship with nature or with ego or with the mind. It can be anti-intellectual. These people tend to not be as engaged with this world problems and political issues and all this kind of stuff, which is kind of why we see with Wilbur that he's not really involved as a leader. He's not really taking us anywhere. He doesn't have a transformative plan. He's kind of just like, yeah, like capitalism, conscious capitalism. Sure, why not, right? There's nothing transformative, really. There's not even too much care about what happens in the world or what happens in the community. It's kind of just all a dream, reincarnating his way through life and blessing the world with his amazing intellect. Of course, I have had spiritual experiences myself. I've also taken psychedelics. I know what a lot of these people are talking about. I understand the non-dual thing. And I think the non-dual thing is valid. I think the non-dual philosophy, the perennial philosophy, this idea of unity beyond the illusion of separateness, I think that's totally valid. And I think it can cash out in a very naturalistic way, like connected, like we're all parts of the universe. That's still true, even if there's not like a supernatural, transcendent ground of all being to which we're all connected. Like, you don't need that part of it. It can just be this worldly. And I think that's good. I actually think it's better. I think not only can you have the be here now stuff, but I think that actually you can get a lot of good stuff from other traditions, like the pagan magic, manifesting, creating, not just the being sort of stuff. If you actually take a real integral approach and include a bunch of factors, there's actually a lot of good stuff from a lot of traditions, not just Buddhism. Ken Wilber has a conflationary kind of approach, which is bad integration. And if he could actually do a ground up case for his view to come and debate me, what we would see is what we already do see. Wilbur translates his spiritual experience in a very inside-the-box traditional way. He even says traditions maintain and is constantly appealing to the translations of regular practitioners in these spiritual and religious traditions. And he kind of tends to always steer everything back into his Advaita Vedanta Buddhist Hindu type of worldview. This is storybook translation stuff. If we were talking about a Christian and their spiritual experience, we would say the same thing. We would say, yeah, you went to church, you had an amazing experience, but you're translating it inside of the worldview of the storybook logic. That's why you're saying that Jesus came and touched your heart, and that there was this still small voice that was God speaking to you and telling you to repent. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that's happening that's not just the experience itself, but that's in the translation of the experience. You kind of have to already start from believing in God and Jesus and all this stuff to even have this experience. So ultimately what we want to do is we want to keep things like the non-dual perspective. We want to keep things like meditation. We want to keep things like these spiritual experiences and divorce them from the tradition and the dogma, and realize that there's a bunch of people making claims about what's going on. We have to have fair overarching standards in terms of our integration of all traditions, and have fair overarching standards in terms of epistemology, in terms of what conclusions we can come to based on what. A lot of people talk about, oh, well, this is not like a science issue, this is a metaphysics issue, as if by appealing to metaphysics they can somehow slip out of having to make sense. No. Metaphysics goes back to Aristotle, what he originally called first philosophy. And it was a lot of these topics that we're talking about here. Epistemology, ontology, cosmology. These are all metaphysical subjects. These are all metaphysical tools. The scientific method is an epistemic methodology rooted in ontological understanding, as demonstrated in my last video, to come to ontological and cosmological conclusions. This is what I've explained. So this is metaphysics, if you understand how to do philosophy. Another thing I'm hearing is that cosmology isn't a topic that you learn about with science, but that these answers are derived with vision logic or transrationally. And this is one of these situations where a person is using a word and they don't know what it means. They actually can't make a pre-trans distinction because they're committing the fallacy while they're using the word. They're saying the word transrational, but clearly the ideas don't even rise to a rational level, not even the baseline rational level. And these people aren't speaking poetically. This isn't some kind of a metaphorical way of talking about ultimacy. No, these people are making literal truth claims. So if you make a literal truth claim about the way the world works, you have to test it empirically. You're talking about a rational claim. You have to test it with tools on the rational level.
If they're making an empirical claim, check it empirically. Check it empirically. Check it empirically.
Phenomenology is real and material science is real, but where phenomenology tries to deny material science, don't listen to it. And where material science tries to deny interiority and phenomenology, don't listen to it. Phenomenology is real and material science is real.
So don't be like, oh, well, you're clearly just orange. It's like, just because I can use an orange tool doesn't make me orange. Just because I start with a idealistic premise doesn't make me an idealist. I'm an integralist. I take good stuff where I find it. So this is not some pre-trans fallacy number one. It's not a rejection of religion. My video that I put out just before this Sword in the Stone challenge was about integral spirituality and integral religion. So don't give me any of that like, he's orange, he doesn't value religion stuff, okay? It's not going to work. Most of my videos are about religion. I'm sorry, if your ideas are not at least rational, then don't come around telling me that you think that they're trans-rational. That just means that you don't know what they mean. That's pre-trans fallacy number two. That's trying to lift up a magical, mythical idea to transrational glory that it does not deserve. If it can't make a rational case for what you're talking about, then that idea is pre-rational, or at least not up to rational standards. So the problem with Wilbur is that he's appealing to tradition and he ends up in storybook logic. If he put his case on the table, we would find religious interpretation, storybook logic is part of his story. That's why his case isn't good. That's why it doesn't stand. I've already made a case for this in my What You Talking About Wilbur videos. You can dig into that for more details. Next, I would like to talk about people like Bernardo. Bernardo Castro, who is an academic, and don't even get me started on academia. It seems like basically where we're at with them is that you can believe anything you want, and as long as you go through the motions, they'll give you your receipt, they'll give you your diploma. So you can be Bernardo and you can be talking about this theory that a lot of the professors clearly think is sort of stupid at your doctorate thesis defense. And the questions you'll get asked are, how does this relate to Kant or Schopenhauer? How does this compare to Kierkegaard? Things like this. And as long as he can answer those things with not really too hard a pushback, he's going to get his doctoral degree or whatever. But that whole thing is built on fallacies. Are they even able to cut him down and deny him his degree, or has he bought and paid for it? That's the problem. Capitalism has kind of corrupted academia to the point where we can't really even talk about what's true. You just get the buffet and take what you like, and as long as you can kind of reasonably defend it, it's fine, let it pass. There's no kind of standards for truth. It's all just about how you perform. As you know, I also made a video about Bernardo Castro, kind of featuring Deepak Chopra, because as we know, after Deepak Chopra got thoroughly schooled, he started surrounding himself with the token idealist scientists who will go along with the idealist narrative. And so he found Bernardo. It's interesting, there's basically a lot of pseudoscientists who get caught up in this like mystical science thing, and the new age just loves them and like builds them up and funds them and like treats them really well. But anyways, I was listening to Bernardo's case for mind at large, which is basically like this looks like this, so they must be the same kind of logic for a lot of it, and just like giant leaps in logic, like really kind of like laughable stuff if you actually know how to think in a logical and rational kind of way. If you're at all skeptical, you're probably not going to follow this guy. Bernardo tried to copy strike that video because that's how he deals with his critics. Instead of facing them and trying to defend his ideas, he tries to legally shut them down. So Bernardo's basic approach to propping up idealism is starting from circular reasoning, like his thing is true, and then finding whatever he can to try to prop up his case. Well, quantum theory looks like it proves my thing true. Near-death experience probably helps to hold it up. I can find some cases from that. Well, look, here's a scientific paper. That makes it look official. That's really good and sciencey. I have it. I'm a doctor. Multiple personality disorder. That's kind of like the mind at large kind of thing that I'm talking about. I could use that and say, look, there's a thing that happens. It's like just grabbing whatever you can. Again, they don't have a ground up positive case. They have all of these like one little prop things. In fact, it can be like a multi-headed hydra of these props with people sometimes, you know? You cut down one, you cut down the parsimony, and then here comes quantum theory, and then you cut down quantum theory, you're like, no, that's just at the quantum level. And they're like, well here, what about the scientific paper? That makes it look sciencey. See, some scientists agree with this. So you see what I'm saying? It's just like grab bag of whatever they could find to prop it up and make it seem legit. And you get this kind of grab bag case when you're introduced to it buffet style. It's like, you want this idea? Okay, well, here's this idea, and here are the different arguments that go with it. These Bernardo guys, they don't make the ground up case. Like this ground up thing is especially good from them because they do start from the epistemic primary. Like all we know is everything through our consciousness. And then they leap to this conclusion about, well, it must be mind at large. And look, we have multi-personality disorders. It's like, what? How are you putting all these things together? Like the logic string is just a mess. There's huge gaps and leaps in it. And it's very clear if you put it on the table like this from a ground up thing. He uses parsimony. And if we're really doing parsimony, if you're really going to say that all we know is consciousness, then you have to sort of stop at step one and say, all we know is consciousness, and we don't even know what consciousness really is. So you don't end up an idealist, as he says, you end up a hard agnostic or as a solipsist. So his parsimony thing doesn't even lead to his conclusion, which is why doing it in this ground up kind of way actually can be really strategic depending on who you're debating. Lastly, I want to talk to the panpsychists out there. Maybe you're saying that you're following me all the way up to the emergence thing, but science doesn't really know and all this kind of stuff. Well, again, I want to say that we know that non-living things don't act like they have any subjectivity, which is why we even make the distinction between living and non-living things. You can talk about the hard problem and you can talk about weak and strong emergence, but to me, those kinds of things sound like creationist arguments where they don't really understand what's being talked about. There's not a mechanism that allows for consciousness to turn on out of matter. That's not what anybody's claiming. It's more like a dimmer switch, which is why in that graph I show, it's green for a long time before you get to any kind of blue down at the end. Lots of red, lots of green, a little bit of blue. The subjectivity is like towards the end of this kind of thing. And that green spectrum probably has a lot of winding up. I want to explore the details of some of that kind of stuff more, but I know that part of the way that these people argue is that until you know everything, until you can say for sure everything, they're going to feel like there's enough of a gap for them to say, you didn't explain everything, you didn't show the spot where one thing becomes the other thing, so therefore I can still believe what I want to believe. Well, I mean, I've seen a TED Talk video that does a pretty good job of showing how you can create life, simple protocells in a lab. If we're going to draw the line and say that this is where the beginnings of consciousness come online, well, we can say these ingredients together achieve X, Y, and Z, and there's your on switch if you want to draw the line in that arbitrary place. But I'm assuming that if I show you that you're not really going to feel satisfied by that. I feel like no matter what you show these people at any level along the spectrum of the line of development, they're just going to be like, yeah, that's not the full thing. There was already stuff there before. There's still more to come after. It's not really doing it for me. You know what I mean? They're not going to be satisfied with really any kind of rational case about the development of consciousness through the complexity of beings over time. Okay, fine. I mean, I think we can really skillfully make that case. Like I said, I will try, but it's not really on us. We make that case. We have good one-to-one correlation. We have explanatory power. We have predictive power. We have a really solid theory around this kind of stuff. Do they have any good reason to think that non-living stuff has any form of consciousness? I'm looking for that argument. I'm looking for the positive argument that's not a God of the gaps argument, and it's not an argument from ignorance. Like, well, we don't know how it could be any other way, so it must be in there. Not a good argument. So, enough with the false equivalency. Emergentism is a valid theory. These guys can't even get off the ground. So, Wilbur, I know you're not going to debate me, obviously. Probably not even watching this. You're so not in touch with this community, and you're definitely not the kind of person to get involved. Longtime philosopher, never been in a debate. So, I know you won't debate me, but here's my invitation. Step up, debate me. Can you defend these ideas? I've made criticisms about you in public, about how you're getting it wrong, about how it messes up and betrays your whole project. Pretty damning criticisms. A lot of people have said they agree with that kind of stuff. Your critics are out here, man. Step to us. I don't know. Come on out. Demonstrate. Put us in our place. Bernardo, prove me wrong, man. See if you can do a ground up case. Step to me. Debate me. If you have something to say about the video I made about you, let's have a talk about it. Panpsychicsts, if you can make a case for why we should think that non-living stuff has some kind of subjectivity, that's not a God of the gaps argument or an argument from ignorance, but that's actually a positive case to try to falsify your hypothesis, hit me up. I'd love to see that. Until then, until someone is able to even attempt to pull the sword from this stone, I'm going to say idealists and panpsychists are done in our community. Here's the line. It's the rational line. If you can't step to the rational line, then you don't get to hang out on the trans-rational side. It's the test. And we need to have these tests. We need to have these boundaries. You need to be able to make a pre-trans distinction. Otherwise, the trans stuff isn't really trans, and it's not welcome in our communities. We need to actually have healthy boundaries, and people need to really know how to use our tools. You have to be able to use rationality and logic. You can't just call people who use it orange. Orange is an important part of the developmental spiral. If you can't use the sword of truth that comes at orange, then you don't get to move developmentally higher. You got to go back and get the sword. Otherwise, you're going to start incorporating in stupid beliefs, which is why we've set up the sword and the stone.
All right, for the Philosopher King.
I am putting putting your outdated ideas to sleep. These idealists and panpsychists need not speak. When it comes to this sword in the stone, it's well known that they
pull out game weak.
I see you back at it, calling science dogmatic. Why you dressing up your batshit creationism tactics?
Just put it in a rational package, make it look like what it's lacking.
Actual backing, just acting. You can't even really make a ground-up case. Holding pre-rational ideas, man, it's such a disgrace. And you won't admit when you were wrong, you run away to save face. It's about that time that someone puts you in your place. These idealists and panpsychists need not speak. When it comes to this sword in the stone, it's well known that they
pull out game weak.
No, they can't even falsify the things that they think. When it comes to logic, they
pull out game weak.
talk a whole lot of shit, but now the challenge out, they act all meek. You know why?
Pull out game weak.
Step up and get your ass kicked.
Pull out game weak.
Hear ye, it's like they can't even hear me. Out here comparing empty claims to a scientific theory. It's false equivalence they seek.
Pull out game weak.
They must really fear me, afraid to even get near me. Get the argument critiqued. My flaming sword will slice sincerely, so sincerely, patiently and clearly. Expose your fallacy technique.
Pull out game weak.
Peer review. Debunked, outdated, and overdue.
Well, hold on a second. It seems to me to be a reasonable view.
Step up and I'll show you how it all falls through. These idealists and panpsychists need not speak. When it comes to this sword in the stone, it's well known that they
pull out game weak.
No, they can't even falsify the things that they think. When it comes to logic, they
pull out game weak.
talk a whole lot of shit, but now the challenge out, they act all meek. You know why?
Pull out game weak.
Step up and get your ass kicked.
Pull out game weak.
By the way, the day that I dropped the video about the sword in the stone, January 20th, has now been declared a holiday, Sword in the Stone Day, for all of you idealists and panpsychists, and really anyone holding a superstitious or irrational idea. This will be a day in which we celebrate getting over irrational ideas. I hope that you will celebrate with us. Thanks so much for watching. Big up to my Patreons. Buy the merch, limited time once we get to 2K. This merch is going to be gone. Everything's going to change. But this sword in the stone will remain. Make sure you go check out the videos. Thanks so much for watching. Peace!
Step up and get your ass kicked.
Pull out game weak.